This is Newsmax TV. I'm Ashley Martella. A Pakistani American accused of driving a car bomb into Times Square in New York City is being charged with terrorism and mass destruction. Here to discuss this with us is a prominent native New Yorker, former U.S. Representative Vito Fossella. For 12 years, he represented New York's 13th congressional district, which includes Staten Island and part of Brooklyn. He was the only Republican in Congress from New York City and had very high scores for his votes from the American Conservative Union. Welcome to Newsmax again, Vito.
Thanks so much, Ashley. Good to be with you.
Latest reports about the Times Square bomber suggest another major U.S. security lapse. The suspect, Faisal Shahzad, was on the no-fly list, yet he managed to get on a jetliner at JFK Airport bound for the United Arab Emirates after the botched bombing attempt. He was eventually yanked off that plane, but he was able to give investigators the slip and head to the airport even though he was under surveillance since mid-afternoon. What do you think about all this?
First off, is a tremendous credit to law enforcement, the New York City Police Department, the FBI, the Joint Terrorism Task Force for apprehending this individual in about 53 hours time from the time he tried to blow up his SUV in the middle of Times Square, which would have just been mayhem. It could have led to the destruction and death of hundreds of people and clearly would have affected our psyche for years to come. Fortunately, it did not detonate. Fortunately, we were able to apprehend them, but still some questions remain as to how is an individual on a no-fly list able to pay cash and get on an airline and pull down the tarmac at JFK and almost flee the country. I think what Homeland Security and others need to do is to fix that loophole, to figure out what went wrong to ensure it doesn't happen again. But it's also a strong and vivid reminder how this war against terror, I know maybe the current administration doesn't want to call it so much that, but we still have those who want to wage war against us. And the reality is that there are different battlefields. There are battlefields in Afghanistan where brave men and women are fighting terrorists overseas. In Iraq, again, members of the military are putting terrorism out once and for all, or attempting to. But the battlefields also exist in our country. Here in New York City, since 9/11 alone, there have been almost 3 dozen attacks that have been foiled. They're not going away. We need to ensure that we are vigilant against those terrorists. And secondly, I think it also speaks to some of these decisions that need to be made in Washington, particularly relative to providing civilian trials for terrorists. There was a push many months ago to try Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was the mastermind behind September 11th attacks, and four of his colleagues. There was an attempt to bring them to civilian trial, and of all places, downtown New York. Many of us have been arguing against that wrong-headed decision for months, and yet it's still on the table.
In one of our previous interviews, you took great exception to the Christmas Eve underwear bomber being read Miranda rights. Turns out Faisal Shahzad was read Miranda rights too. Yet reports say he's providing valuable information to investigators, according to Attorney General Eric Holder. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think we still have to, I err on the side, if somebody's a declared enemy combatant of this country, should not be treated as a normal, run-of-the-mill criminal. Even though there are some who say we're getting valuable information, we don't know what that is. And we think the way we can glean and obtain information would be a lot different, and I think incredibly more valuable if we didn't apply the same standards we apply to every citizen, and if you will, every common law criminal, as to those who want to bring our country to its knees. I just don't understand that if we believe, at least the first news out is that he was getting trained in Pakistan. Clearly, with those who were training him how to use bombs, who have a knowledge of others who want to continue to bring this country harm and hurt our fellow citizens. So I don't think these policy decisions being made in Washington are the right ones right now.
All right, as you mentioned earlier, Shahzad reportedly told investigators he was trained at a terrorism camp in Pakistan, in an area where the Pakistani Taliban operates with impunity. In your opinion, should the Obama administration be doing anything about that, and what, if anything, could they do?
Well, one would hope that there's a coordination to identify where that camp is and to root it out. And if it's up to our brave men and women in the military, that's being taken care of.
Do you think the fact Obama, as you note, will not use words like radical Islam, war on terror, or even call a terrorist, do you think that makes us look weak in the eyes of our enemies and perhaps encourages more terrorist attacks?
Well, there were those on, let's call it on the left who feels that if we had closed Guantanamo Bay or we'd done a number of different things that the terrorists would go away, that if we speak kindly about them and to them, they're going to go away. We have to just call it what it is. The reality is that most of those who have committed atrocities here in this country, those who attempted, happen to have their roots in radical Islamic terrorism. That's what they're all about.
You're very knowledgeable in areas of finances. Now, New York City, of course, is the financial capital of America. Let's focus on financial reform. The Chris Dodd bill calls for the biggest regulatory overhaul of the financial services sector since the 1930s, includes provisions for greater consumer protections and tighter government control of the financial industries. What's your take on that?
Well, it's sad because this is no surprise what's happening in these days in Washington. It seems like whenever there's a problem, or whenever there's an issue to be solved, the solution out of Washington is we need a 2,000-page bill of more regulation, of more taxation, of more government control of the free market or a capitalist society. And while there may be good components and debate that occurs with respect to financial reform, the focus should be on modernizing it. The focus should be on improving the system as opposed to saddling it with more and more regulation that's only going to destroy creativity, destroy the entrepreneurial spirit that keeps this country alive. The fact is that while there may have been problems in the last few years, those who committed those acts or committed those or caused those problems should be brought to justice. And I think what's also happening here in Washington more recently is this division. Instead of uniting this country as we see fit to promote good growth policies, low taxation, good, efficient regulation, what's happening is you see this class warfare that's occurring more and more to separate Wall Street, the financial service industry, from Main Street, when in reality they should go hand in hand. We should have a policy in this country that promotes good, clean, efficient markets, that creates wealth, that facilitates and encourages investment and opportunity. And in that type of environment, with that type of regulatory approach, we will have Wall Street and Main Street tied at the hip, winning together, as opposed to this division that's occurring. And more importantly, as it relates to New York, the greatest contributor to the tax base of New York City is the financial service sector. If you destroy that sector, you take away the opportunity to pay firemen and teachers and build new parks and build new roads and across the board. So let's be very, very clear about what's happening here. There's an attempt to solve a problem, and in many cases, the solution is going to be worse than the problem itself.
And finally, there's talk now about imposing a national sales tax called a value-added tax, or VAT, to deal with the deficit. What do you think that would do to the economy, Congressman?
Well, again, it's no surprise. It'll hurt the economy. This seems to be a pattern of becoming more like the old socialized welfare state of Europe. I haven't come across too many American citizens lately, all while I was in Congress, that said, I want my taxes to be raised. So we've already created a situation where taxes are too high, where at the end of this year tax cuts will expire, and that means tax rates will increase, and it will hurt the economy in and of itself. But when you ram a health care bill down the throats of the American people and suggest incorrectly that it's actually going to save money and actually going to save money from the deficit and taxpayers, you've created a situation where you have nowhere to turn. So it's no surprise that there are those who are trying to float the trial balloon, which should be a lead balloon, of a value-added tax. The focus should be on reducing the tax burden of the American people, creating incentives and pro-growth policies, reduce the regulatory burden to allow our capitalist spirit to grow, and not leave the next generation or generations with unbelievable deficits and debt that sooner or later somebody's going to have to repay.
Former New York City Congressman Vito Fossella, thanks again so much for talking with us here at Newsmax.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you for watching Newsmax TV.